Welcome to the Aging Together podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Pooja Ashok Patel, an occupational therapist, board certified in gerontology with additional specialty certifications in dementia, fall prevention, and geriatric care. In this podcast, I interview guests who are experts in their fields and caregivers who share their lived experiences. Let's meet today's guest. Lisa Dare is principal and CEO of Lisa Dare & Associates. She is an executive coach, leadership practitioner, consultant, and speaker with close to 20 years of experience. Her background includes practicing as a clinical hospital pharmacist, a medical sales representative for several major pharmaceutical companies, and certified fitness instructor. As a dedicated lifelong learner, she is continually adding new and innovative tools to her coaching and consulting toolkit. This enables her to support clients in becoming the best version of themselves in the pursuit of living their biggest and greatest life. In addition to her business pursuits, she is a caregiver to her mom and continually learning how to juggle priorities between work and personal life. Hi, Lisa. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks, Pooja. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. Can you share a brief overview of your caregiving journey, including your mom's diagnosis and the roles that you and your sisters played?
Yeah, so actually it started even before my mom, because it started with my dad, who this would have been 7 years ago, suffered a hemorrhagic stroke. And as a result of that, was moved into long-term care. That was sort of my first experience with caregiving. So while he was in a facility where there were obviously people taking care of him, we also spent a lot of time with him because there were some impacts from his stroke. Certainly his mobility was impacted. Unfortunately, he didn't regain a lot of mobility. He became quite weak and was wheelchair bound. He was able to do a few things for himself, but we started to get involved in terms of spending time with meals because he would have some challenges with feeding himself. So we did that. And then I think, somewhere along his journey, my mom started to have some behavioral changes, which at first I think we sort of perhaps attributed to the fact that, my dad was in long-term care. They were no longer able to live together and had been together for a long time. So you sometimes think the spouse gets impacted in certain ways from that. And then it became apparent shortly after my dad passed 4 years ago that there was something really that didn't seem to be in line with just maybe a depression or just aging. And then we received a diagnosis when my mom was at the Seniors Health Center that she appeared to have the symptoms of what would be some type of dementia. And so since that time, my sister and I have been her primary caregivers, along with support from healthcare aides. And our intent is to actually have her be able to be at home through her journey through this.
That's awesome to hear that you're doing everything with keeping her at home, if that's her goal. That's one part that I think we really try to talk a lot about is if someone's goal is to age at home and eventually die at home, there's a lot we can do to make that a reality, right? It's just a matter of getting the right supports involved, the right people involved, and that takes a lot of work. When we first talked, you mentioned that you also have a career and that it can be demanding at times too. And so how do you manage to balance your career and your caregiving responsibilities? And what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a huge question, Pooja, and it continues to ebb and flow. So I'm fortunate enough that with what I do, I'm an executive coach. I do consulting work. I facilitate as well. So I've been very fortunate that with a good chunk of the work that I do, I'm able to work remotely from home and do a lot of virtual work. I do have to do some in-person work as well because I teach at the university where I live here in continuing education. But it does require a lot of coordination and support in terms of having healthcare aides. So we're fortunate that where I live, there's a plan where we can actually hire support help from a third-party agency, and we have a certain amount of coverage through our healthcare plans here. And then the remaining hours that are not covered, we are responsible for paying for that ourselves. I coordinate with my sister's schedule. My husband helps out as well. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of support outside with our extended family because they are also aging and they also have their own challenges that they're dealing with. So I think, one of the things that I would say, Pooja, is that it is something that requires not only a lot of sort of logistical coordination, but it also requires a certain kind of, I think, mindset as well. Because one of the things that I discovered being on this journey is you get a lot of people saying, "Oh, and so are you planning on, putting in her, put her in a home? Are you on a wait list?" And so I don't know how many of your listeners encounter that, but there's this assumption that that's what we do, right? And there's a number of things that, make that a challenge. One is, to your point, some people just want to be able to age at home. And I think many people, certainly through the pandemic, started to realize if they were at that stage of life where they might be thinking about those things, that they're already considering that. Because I think we're seeing a lot of people already thinking about, how do I adapt my home to allow me to age in place? And I think the other thing is, and I'm pretty sure that this is the US experience as well, because I'm in Canada, is that we don't have enough facilities for people, right? We simply don't have enough facilities for people. I think it's also a challenge with having enough staffing, right? I don't know if that's an issue for you in the US, but here in Canada, that's also the challenge, right? We don't have enough staffing to simply be able to provide the kind of care that people need or may want. And I think, in addition to that, it's, from a career perspective, it's making sure that you take care of yourself and you don't judge how much you do or can't do, right? Recently, I've scaled back a little bit to say no to some things because I just know there's too much of an emotional load and a time commitment that I may not be able to make for it. And so you accept that. And then you know that, you kind of ride one wave and then you'll ride another. So it's kind of like surfing. It's sometimes you're going to be able to ride that wave. Sometimes the water is going to be choppy and you just have to be able to go with that.
You're absolutely correct. So yeah, similar to Canada, we have a huge crisis right now in long-term care. In the US, we shut down, I think it was over 850 facilities last year due to various things, staffing, quality of care, fraudulent care, right? And so the pandemic obviously had an influence on healthcare workers and impacted the availability of care workers. But then furthermore, the institutions aren't available to even provide the care, right? But there is, at least in the US, we're seeing an influx in providers who are shifting a little bit up to that home visiting model because people do want to stay at home. More and more people want to live at home. The majority of the baby boomer population wants to stay at home. And so we're seeing a shift in the care model there as well, with, a lot of providers offering treatment and consultations at home, which I think is fantastic. But I still think we have a care worker shortage in general, right? Especially we're not prepared for how many people are going to need help in the next 10 years. You mentioned that you are a coach.
An executive coach. So most of my clients that I work with, Pooja, are leaders, managers, new leaders as well.
Is that what you were always doing?
I was not. So at one point in time, I was actually a hospital pharmacist. That's where I actually started my career. And I think that's the other thing to what you're saying, Pooja, is that as a caregiver, one of the things that I've discovered is, education and learning is key. So it's the more that you can educate yourself, inform yourself, ask questions, really reach out and engage all of the different members of the team So to what you were talking about in terms of the shift in the US, we have what's called home care. And with home care, we actually have a dementia care team. And that comprises a nurse, there's an OT, there's a physio, there's also somebody who's a social worker. So they have each of them, obviously have their area of expertise. So in fact, this week, our OT is coming by to do another consult just to look at some maybe more adaptive tools for my mom because she's having some issues with her dental health. And so I think that's the other thing is that, yes, I've relied on my background to be able to think clinically and ask questions and then really seek out the information I think that's missing.
Yeah. And pulling from the available resources to see, okay, this person can help me with this person can help me with this, right? Can I ask what prompted the transition from hospital pharmacy to executive coach?
Yeah, you know what? I guess the short answer is, Pooja, I get bored quite easily. So I I loved my work in the sense that I really loved the patients. I loved working with the other professionals, but I struggled with, I think, the system itself in terms of feeling very, I guess, boxed in. And I think I just have a very entrepreneurial streak in me. So I made a transition to the pharmaceutical industry, which, didn't seem like a big leap. And while I was there, I think, again, just sort of got exposed to coaching when I was doing my professional development plan 1 year and then discovered that was something that I really loved. And that's how I ended up transitioning from that industry into being self-employed and working as a coach and a consultant.
Gotcha. I meant to mention this earlier, but for the US listeners, our version of that is the Alzheimer's Association for Resources and Support. So you've got that dementia team. It looks like, I believe you said it was a client-directed home care is how it's termed. And so you've got that as your formal support between you and your sisters. And then informally, you mentioned it's just really you with your sister, right? Not a whole lot of extended friends or family. Are there any other support systems that you have access to, like in the community or online, that you kind of rely on?
So I would also encourage people to engage with any kind of associations. So I did fairly early on, once I realized what was happening with my mom, I did look at the resources provided from the Alzheimer's Society of Canada. And I know that there would be something similar in the US as well. I also have my own coach. I have a psychologist that I reach out to as well. I think, it's also really important to remember that, in addition to family, we have friends. I would say, informally, we're very fortunate where my parents live because, my mom is still in her own home at the moment. We have great neighbors. So there's a community here of people that look out for one another. They have been absolutely amazing in terms of they help us cut the grass, right? They'll say, hey, I noticed this. Or it's even little things like they put out our recycling and compost bin, right? Once a week for us, right? And all those little things, they seem like small gestures, but they really add up when you think of the amount of time and energy that is required to be a caregiver. And so I'm really grateful for all those little things that people do. And then my own professional community and friends as well. So all of those are different supports that I have.
That's awesome. I love the whole idea of, I feel like when it comes to child care, it's very commonly known that it takes a village, right? Like everyone refers to raising kids as it takes a village. And I always try to draw a parallel with that with caregiving for elders. I'm like, it's the same. It's the same concept. It takes a village to provide proper care for an elder and their family. So I love that you have that community. I kind of want to move into more of your specific caregiving journey. It's obviously been quite a few years, well over 4 years, starting with before your dad passed away. What have some of the biggest challenges been, and how do you overcome them?
Well, I think, certainly one is, people talk a lot about work-life balance, and the term that I find really seems to resonate much more for me and in the work that I do with my clients, as well as work-life harmony, which is to say it's very difficult to strike a balance, right? And often the word balance means a quality of some sort, or, we've got it, you know, an equilibrium of some sort. But I think the term work-life harmony is what I would go with, because at some points in time, you're going to have to dedicate more time to the personal side of things, or more energy to the personal side of things. And sometimes you're going to be able to shift it the other way to work. And so it really is about being able to find the kinds of supports and develop the mindset that helps you to do that. So again, right, I think a big part of this is taking care of our own mental wellness, and that includes our intellectual, wellness, right? But it also means our emotional wellness, and that's, a big thing that I discovered through this, right? As a clinician, because you and I share that background, Pooja, it's very easy to be objective, right, about things and just say, here's the issue here, we can go through the different kinds of tools we have, like soap, right, all of that, we do our assessments. But there's a huge emotional impact to this that I think is important for people to be mindful of, and also to take care of, right? What do we do to take care of not only our physical health but our emotional health? And it is about energy. How do we manage our energy? So that, I think, was a big challenge, right? Because sometimes you're just going flat out and, you're just exhausted by the end of the day, right? And then you've got to get up the next morning and start again, right? And it's like, okay, how do I manage all of that? I think the other challenge that I found, Pooja, was, to be honest, being comfortable with other people's judgment of what you were doing or not doing, right? And I know people are well intentioned, but as I said, Pooja, the number of people that would say to me, like, oh, so are you going to be putting her in a home, right? And it's like, no, because it's not the norm, right? So being comfortable with and being okay with the fact that other people are going to have their opinions, but really sticking to what you believe is best and what you're prepared to do. Being able to ask for help, I think, is a big one, right? We talk about it in so many different situations, but in this case, it is like huge, that being open to and being willing to say, this is not my wheelhouse. I need help with this, right? The challenge of not knowing everything, right? Like, even though I had been a healthcare worker, I don't know everything, right? I don't have areas of expertise in everything. Mine was medications, right? It was like drugs and knowing how they work and providing recommendations for that, but being able to admit when I don't know something and being willing to ask for help. One of the things is, I spoke about this recently in a newsletter, is acceptance. As you said, Pooja, the journey, if we choose to have it at home, is accepting that there is an endpoint. And I think sometimes it's also being able to realize when things have shifted and to be able to make difficult decisions. We had to make a difficult decision with my dad because it got to a point where he actually developed an aspiration pneumonia and got very, very sick. And it was the tail end of the pandemic. And we've then had to face a reality, which is he is, approaching end of life, because, the amount of things that had happened to him and where he was leading to that. And so I think, that's also a challenge, right? Is sometimes the caregiver may have difficulty accepting the reality of the situation. So it certainly is not a journey for the faint of heart, I will say, but it certainly is something that I think really helps us as individuals realize what we're made of and what we're capable of.
Yeah. And that's not to negate that, if you know that it's not for you, then you're still going to get the judgments, right? Why aren't you helping? Why aren't you doing more? And you still follow that same process. And you have to accept that it's okay if you can't and that there are alternatives. And that's another decision. It's a difficult decision that you have to make and accept at some point. Some of the other guests I've spoken with, we've talked about how caregiving itself is a grieving journey, right? You're grieving it from the start because you know that there's that endpoint, and you're grieving the loss of your routines, the dysfunctional environment potentially, or perhaps, right? There's a lot of interruptions in routines and habits depending on if someone's having a good day or a bad day, right? Because that fluctuates. There's a lot of that too. And so I've talked a lot about with other guests on how it's okay to have that grieving process throughout the caregiving journey as well. Something you mentioned earlier was work-life balance and work-life harmony. And I agree with you. One of the terms that I've heard a lot lately is work-life integration, and really understanding when one needs to have priority over the other, right? And it's not always going to be 50-50. And so speaking a little bit about work, because I know that as entrepreneurs, as like coaches, we kind of have that ability to maintain our schedule, be flexible, like take on clients, not take on clients, right? But there's also that risk of losing your professional identity or your career progression because you are taking a step back, right? While you're taking care of your mom, how are you maintaining your professional identity and career progression while you still actively, try to maybe take less clients or kind of create a flexible work schedule?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, I did have to make some decisions around what is it that I wanted to focus on. So what I mean by that is, like, for years, I maintained my pharmacy license. Finally made the decision to go non-practicing on that, and will probably at some point retire it. But I still do some work with pharmacists, so I get a lot of joy in that. For me, it's been about being very selective about what I'll say yes to, and being okay with saying no to some things, right? What is it that, so for me, as a coach, we are required, because I'm a credentialed coach, I am required to maintain a certain amount of continuing education hours. So the great thing is there's lots of ways to do that. I can do online learning. I do make time to also have in-person contact with our senior coaches group. So I do try and make that a priority to be able to create space for that. And I do create, I think, space in my schedule, Pooja, for just on a daily basis, like a little bit of reading, or just kind of keeping up with the most topical issues that are happening for the clients that I work with. Because most of my clients are in the business world. Typically, those are the kinds of clients that I work with. So I have a few resources that I like to kind of just check into that help me to sort of keep on top of that. I think it's honestly really being very intentional and purposeful about making space for that, creating space to say, this is my time to catch up on something, or I'll be mindful of how much I take on. But right now, for example, I'm just working on a project as for marker training, which means that I can help evaluate coaches in training. So I think it's like, be selective, but make sure that you're doing something that sort of keeps you fresh and relevant, and be thoughtful about how you slot all those things in. So I'm creating space for one pro bono client. I got an offer for that, so I'm going to say yes to that. But it is about being very thoughtful about, what do I say yes to? What do I say no to? And again, to your point, some people also make the decision to step back from their career and decide that they take a hiatus. I guess that just wasn't a choice for me, because I felt like if I only committed to just being the caregiver, I think that I would feel like a piece of me would get lost. And I needed that just for my own intellectual stimulation and just to sort of keep myself engaged in something as well. So I think it's important for caregivers to have something that is really their own, right? Because we end up pouring so much of ourselves out. And, the expression is you can't pour out from an empty cup, right? So it's also finding those things that will fill you up, right? And being very vigilant and very fierce about protecting that and not judging it.
Yeah, you have to have some way of maintaining your sense of identity, a purposeful one, too. Professional life aside, how has caregiving impacted your personal life? And what strategies have you used to kind of cope with the stress and maintain your well-being? So, you kind of just mentioned you can't pour from an empty cup. What are some of your things that fill that cup so it doesn't go empty?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think has been super helpful for me is, as you said, routines can be disrupted. Unexpected things can happen. And it's like, okay, I was thinking X, it's not going to happen today.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to do is find like those micro strategies, I'll call them, right? So every night, right, I have a meditation app. So I put that on, right? I do like a little mini meditation, or I make sure, lately it's been some physical health. So it's like every night I'm doing a plank for, a minute and a half, right? Like just to kind of ground myself. It's even just taking small breaks throughout the day because, again, working from home means I'm in front of my computer a lot. So taking those micro breaks, for me, it's walking. So as much as I can, getting outside, even if it's briefly for 10, 15 minutes, doing that. And from a relationship perspective, when I'm here with my mom, my husband is at home in our house. And so when that happens, we talk every day, twice a day. So it's in the morning and in the evening. Sometimes, if there's a break during the day, we'll do that as well. So I think that's also important as well, is to make sure that you nurture those most important relationships. And I think one of the ways to do that as well, Pooja, is to literally schedule it in, right? Because it can feel overwhelming as a caregiver because you feel like, oh my gosh, this is 24/7. But the reality is our loved one, the person that we're caring for, at some point will sleep, at some point eats. And so we do still have little pockets of time. So I think those micro breaks, micro interventions can be really helpful because they're less likely to be disrupted. And the other thing that I do is once a month, I do actually plan some kind of a retreat, whether it be a weekend where I book something out of town, or even if I do a staycation, or I choose to do something that interests me like a hobby. So those are some of the things that I do to actually maintain my own wellness.
Yeah, all of that is super, super important. And I'm glad that you make that a priority. I'm very much like you. If it's not on the calendar, it's not happening. And so for a very long time, even now, sometimes if I have a busy day, I like block in even like lunch, right? Like it's like, okay, I need to eat lunch at this time because it's like the little things that it slips your mind, right? When you're so busy and you're doing stuff. And I love the concept of the micro routines. It could even be as simple as like, I have a very, my husband sometimes, points it out and it's just like, if we're traveling or something, I don't get that. And so he knows and he's like, oh, you're missing your routine. But I have a very specific like time of day where I like make my coffee a certain way and I sit and I read in my specific spot. And it's like a daily little small routine that is halfway between my work day, right? And so it's like rejuvenating for me. And it's just like, if I don't do that one day, like I just feel maybe upset or aggravated or frustrated. And it's like just the smallest thing, right? But those mini routines really can impact your overall day and your mood and everything. And so I do like that you have those as well. Now, you mentioned that you and your sister, how have the two of you navigated the dynamics of the caregiving together? And what advice do you have for others who might be in similar situations? Because oftentimes there are multiple siblings involved, right? And a lot of times it comes down to who's going to handle what and how and when and why. And yeah, so can you share a little bit about how you and sister handle that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, as you were saying that, the thing that came up for me is communication. Communication, 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 right? Don't assume that the other person knows what you're talking about, right? It's funny because as I reflect on that, Pooja, it's very much what I would be. A lot of the things that I do in my work with my clients translates into this, right? Because it's like, how do you establish that connection with your team members, right? When you're working in a team environment, right? It's you're communicating your expectations, you're communicating your needs, right? You're communicating your wants. You are always, I think, working on that level of trust because you can't always assume that it's there, right? This is a really bumpy ride that you're on, right? And you don't know. It's easy to take things for granted, and we can always think that the relationships that we have with our family are bulletproof, but they can sometimes be even more vulnerable, right? And we don't know. And so it's about really establishing a space where you can communicate openly and freely, support one another, and not make each other wrong, right? Because, there's a lot that goes on where, to your point, we can struggle with a lot of judgment, both externally, but also internally, right? It's like, oh, I'm not doing enough, right? Oh, I'm not a good daughter, right? Oh, a good daughter would do this, right? Or a good son would do that, right? It's like, oh, a good daughter would have never done that, right? Or been that way or behaved that way. And we're human, right? This is like an experience like no other. You're under a tremendous amount of stress a lot of the time. And so I think, what, we've got to go easy on ourselves. So I would say that for my sister and I, it's been a journey. I am really happy that she's also seeking support as well, because she's a very different person than me. So she has her supports, which I think is important. I think we should encourage, one another to have those supports outside of the family. We have worked really hard on modes of communication, right? She likes text messages, right? So it's like, okay, if I need to reach out to her about something, I'm usually texting her, right? We sort of coordinate things. As I said, I think what I found is when in doubt, over communicate. Because I think to, what you spoke about earlier, Pooja, it reminded me that grieving process, it is like going through change. And there's a phenomenon with change, which is the transition, right? But when people talk about change, it's not the change that's difficult. It's actually the transition, right? Like from, when you're caring for a parent, you go from child to feeling like the parent, right? It's like, oh, now I'm the parent and my parent is like the child, right? You have a role reversal. That's a huge transition. And I would say too that it's also about normalizing the emotional impact that this is going to have on one another, to just make that okay, right? But also be, I think, watchful for maybe things that your family members might need. If you see a change in behavior, or if you see them struggling, maybe just check, also be mindful and check in with them. But I would say that the hardest part of this, Pooja, is we sometimes take those relationships for granted, but how many of us actually have really open communication with our family members? We all communicate in our own style. I had a conversation with a very good friend recently, and he said something very interesting to me, because he said what he discovered when he reflected on how his family interacted with one another is, he said, we talked, but he said, we never really communicated. And so I thought that was a very interesting comment that he made.
Yeah. It draws parallels with when someone says, I can hear you, but I'm not listening to you.
Yeah.
Is there a cultural component here? In our South Asian culture, a lot of caregiving is cultural, right? There's a sense of filial obligation, there's the filial piety, the duty. And so a lot of that impacts our decision making around what we do and don't do with caring for our parents. Are there any cultural aspects that you feel have impacted your caregiving journey or the way you and your sister managed it together?
Well, I would definitely say yes. It was almost like without a doubt, we were going to be there to support my parents. So to your point, it was like, yeah, kind of like this subconsciously embedded message. But I will say that, I never felt resentful about that. I think the challenge that comes from the cultural piece is that in many cultures, and ours certainly, death is not one of those topics you really want to discuss. It's kind of avoided at all costs, right? And so what I would say is from a practical perspective, that presents challenges because things like having a will, right? Having a personal directive, right? Having power of attorney. Because in addition to the emotional and day to day responsibilities that we have as a caregiver, these are the other practical aspects that we need to also have in place as a caregiver, right? Because it's a whole spectrum of things that we're really dealing with. And so I think, that part has been challenging. And certainly what I've learned from that is that I would do things differently for myself because I see how that can present hardships for a family, right? Making certain decisions. So yes, Pooja, the decisions around in certain medical interventions, right? I'm not sure what in the US, but in Canada, we call it MAID, which is medical assistance in dying. What implications does that have, right? Because I have had friends who've made that decision for their loved ones, right? So, yeah, all of those, I think certainly we have to be mindful of how that might color our decisions. And it can also impact how we might be feeling subconsciously, right? So just being mindful of that.
Yeah. So I do a lot of that mediation and difficult conversations with my clients. And that's the goal. And so what I often advise is get a professional involved. They're a little removed from the situation. They don't have that emotional attachment. And I find that culturally, my parents are more willing to have those conversations with the doctor versus with me, right? And or like with any professional versus the family members. And so sometimes just adding that layer of stranger, right? Or a layer of professional, regardless of the fact that I am a professional, right? That doesn't matter in this
Yeah.
situation. And so I often find that sometimes that can be helpful in making sure that those questions are answered. Because at the end of the day, you will have to make decisions. And it would be very helpful if you knew the answers to those questions, right? Without having to decide on your own on a lot of those things.
No, absolutely.
Something you talked about earlier that I kind of wanted to dig deeper into, just for the sake of our audience who are unfamiliar with it. So, this is a two-part question. Earlier in this conversation, you told me about Canada's publicly funded dementia care team, right? It's called the client-directed home care. Is that specific to that dementia community?
It is. So where I live with our health authority, we have what's called home care. And typically, the traditional home care would be, for example, if somebody came home and actually, this is a friend of mine who was legally blind and had a minor surgery, but he needed assistance with changing his dressings. You could enlist what's called home care, and it is publicly funded. So you're right. And this, he would get a nurse coming in, say, once a day to change his dressing. Depending on what an individual needs, there's an assessment done, and then they can get a certain amount of support, a certain number of hours with somebody coming in. So now this client-directed home care is a newer program, and it actually allows families or an individual who needs home care to actually be able to engage the services of a third party vendor, somebody who's been vetted by the health authority to be able to provide services. There would be an assessment done, and they would say, okay, based on this assessment, you qualify for X number of hours of, funded support, right? If you require hours above that, then you're responsible for that yourself. So why that works well in particular for people with dementia is then you're more likely to get a consistent caregiver, right? Because in the other home care model, there's no guarantee which nurse will come, right? And it could be somebody different every day, or if somebody's sick, then somebody else has to come. Whereas in this case, you're more likely to get more consistent healthcare providers because it is an agency that is providing the service. And that's why it was recommended to us when we were looking into it, because they said that actually is much better, in particular for patients with dementia, because they will get somebody more consistent and people who get to know them, right? And then understand exactly what the individual needs.
Yeah, we do have a similar home health care model here in the US as well that is often covered under health insurance. We don't have very many publicly funded care options when it comes to healthcare, but they've started slowly rolling out a few more dementia-specific care models and options with the growing rates and population of dementia. And so I'm excited to see what might continue to develop over time. Now, so you've said that they've helped you a lot specifically with your family. Also, I believe you mentioned that you participated in a caregiver study of some sort that was aimed at changing government policy. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that was a study that was conducted by a nursing professor out of the University of Alberta, which is actually where I went to university. It's a city about 3 hours north of us. And she was looking specifically to get an understanding of what were the kinds of challenges and the experience of caregivers. And part of that was there would be an interview process. So we were interviewed for a certain period of time. And then all of that data was collected. And then actually it's been presented to our provincial government, which would be the same as a state government. And it is with the intent that that data will help the government to look at different kinds of programs to fund to support caregivers. And hopefully over time as well, Pooja, I think the other thing that needs to change is an employer's understanding of how to accommodate, right, and support their employees who are caregivers, right? Because I think back to, something earlier that we talked about, not everyone has that option to not work, right? If they're a caregiver, right? It may not be financially feasible for a caregiver to not be working in addition to having caregiving responsibilities. But how can employers actually work more in concert with these needs, right? Maybe it's providing more remote work options for employees, right? Maybe it's about modifying work schedules to allow for that, right? Or being more flexible with maybe giving leaves if somebody needs a leave for a period of time and allowing them to come back afterwards, right? So I think, there's a lot of moving parts to this, and there's a lot of different parties that need to be involved in really making this much more successful for caregivers.
Yeah. Do you have any personal, positive or negative experiences when it comes to employers and caregiving options?
So one of the things that I'll say as somebody who is self-employed, right, and working with clients from all kinds of different industries is a number of times I've had my mom wander in, right, while I'm on a call with a client, right? And I had one client last week, and she said something that really impacted me because I said, oh, my healthcare aide was just leaving as we were finishing our call. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. I said, my healthcare aide is just leaving. And she said, you know what? It's about time. She said, you don't need to be sorry. She said, you do not need to apologize for that, because she said, you know what, for far too long, in particular, because she's a woman, She said, as women, we've been apologizing. She said, let me know. That's great that you let me know what the distraction or interruption was, but you don't need to apologize for that. So I think, that was positive in the sense of this is part of life, right? This is, something that is not so unusual that we need to feel like apologetic. And I can also say that the number of times that I've had clients where my mom's like said, what are you doing? And then she pops on the screen, right? Like with my client while I'm talking to them, and I'll say, oh, I'm sorry, explain. And then a number of clients that have said, oh, that's just fine. Like, don't even worry about it. And they're like, oh, she's so cute. And they'll like say hello to her. So I just love when my clients are just sort of like, oh, whatever.
Yeah. I think it normalizes it, right? We don't really blink twice when there's someone's cat or dog is in the video, or if someone's baby's in their lap, or if their kid's in their lap, or the kid walks into the room, right? Like it's normalized, especially since the pandemic. And so I love that your clients are normalizing it, in that way. And I agree with you. There really needs to be less of this burden of apologizing when it comes to distractions that are outside of our control, right? You're correct in that, yes, as women in general, we tend to do this a lot, but I've gotten into the habit of either saying like, thank you for your patience, thank you for waiting for me, or, along those lines, or, hey, can I have a minute? I need to attend to something, or, just trying to phrase it in ways that are a little more intentional, still give them the information that they need to understand what's happening, but without feeling that I have to apologize for it because it's not something I could have controlled, right?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a great point.
What has kept you motivated or inspired throughout the challenging times and throughout this caregiving journey as you kind of go into your 5th year, perhaps?
Well, I think that what I reflect upon again, I'm really all about the moments, right? Because we can get so overwhelmed with the whole big picture of it all, but it really is about those moments and realizing that that moment is fleeting and it will pass at some point. And so what I remind myself of, Pooja, is that at the end of my mom's journey, I will have a whole memory bank of wonderful moments. And it's an intrinsic reward, right? An intrinsic reward of knowing that I participated in and had the ability to impact both of my parents' life in a positive way, right? I was there when my dad passed, but to, be able to be in that moment of creating something for him that gave him peace and allowing him to know that he was loved and safe and cared for. Those are some pretty powerful things, right? I think it's also about knowing what are the things that keep me going. So what keeps me going is I love change. I love new things. So the fact that I can learn something new or try something different or be creative, I think reframing things is a really useful way for us to remain engaged and motivated, right? Instead of saying like, oh my God, like for example, dental, as many people who deal with people with dementia know, dental health care is difficult, right? Challenging. We're dealing with that right now. But then, it's what can we do to help her, right? Oh, now, she only wants to eat certain things. Well, I take that as a opportunity to be creative and research different foods or dishes or ways of cooking things that will work for her. So I think it's a combination of knowing what motivates you, creating opportunities for that to happen, and reframing. Right? It's like, okay, I can see it this way, but I could choose to see it a different way. What would that look like?
Right. Glass half full versus glass half empty, right?
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of reflections, looking back, is there anything you would have done differently throughout the past few years?
I think the only thing that I would say Pooja, and I would think that there might be others in the same situation, is recognize when your resistance or denial button is being pushed. And what I mean by that is, in particular with dementia, it can have a very insidious onset, right? So, what might start off as kind of forgetfulness or, just a little bit of like unusual behavior, I think I was in the beginning quite dismissive of it in the sense of I didn't want to think that that could happen to my mom, right? Or that doesn't happen in our family. And so I think sometimes it's being open and receptive to what's going on and really checking your own reality of a situation, right? Because I think that can, when we're not able to accept that, it can delay, maybe a diagnosis, right? It could delay some interventions that might be helpful. And I would also say too that the other thing is that trust your gut, right? If you notice that, because we noticed the challenges happening for my mom, but I think at one point my sister and I were a bit hesitant to intervene because we felt like that kind of invaded her privacy, because we could see some of the challenges with her just attending to her own hygiene, but we weren't, maybe we could have intervened a little sooner, right? So I think those are some of the things that as I reflect on, that's what I've learned and would do differently.
Yeah. You don't know what you don't know, right? You said that earlier. And so I'm a strong believer in, we make decisions based on the information that we have in that moment, right? And so you're always going to learn something that in retrospect you would impact how you made that decision most likely. What are the top 3 pieces of advice you would give to someone who's starting a caregiver journey?
I think first and foremost, I would say be curious and ask lots of questions. Don't assume that you know everything. Be open to just information and educating yourself as much as possible. And I think the second thing is that make sure that in addition to the plan that you have for the person that you're taking care of, you have a plan for yourself. And what I mean by that is recognizing that there will be an endpoint to the person that you're caring for's journey. And what are you going to do after that? Right? Because it sort of reminds me of how somebody will work 40 years at a company, right? And then they retire and they don't know what to do with themselves. So make sure that you have a plan for yourself that you attend to as well. And then I think the third thing is that it's just learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's, the landscape will change, right? Things will change from day to day. So learn how to ride those waves. You just never know.
Yeah. Those are powerful messages. I think new caregivers would definitely appreciate knowing that early on, especially the planning for yourself. I find that a lot of family caregivers struggle with that because they're so in the moment. They're not thinking 2 steps ahead, right? They're just trying to get through the day. And you're right. It really does feel like retirement, right? Depending on how long your journey is, you lose that sense of, if you've made caregiving your identity and your purpose, you lose that, right? And so it's a very similar concept there. As we wrap up, what is one takeaway you'd like the audience to consider, whether it's related to your experience or even the broader topic of family caregiving?
Well, I think to something that you said earlier, Pooja, is that caregiving can look a lot of different ways. So it doesn't necessarily mean caregiving is, oh, I'm going to be, living with my parents, or I've taken in the person that I'm caring for. You can caregive in a lot of different ways. Even though you may have a loved one in a facility, that doesn't mean that you still can't provide some caregiving for them. Maybe it's just companionship, right? Because maybe, the other needs of the individual are taken care of, but there's a spectrum, and it really is about being honest with yourself about what is it that you feel that you're willing and capable of doing. And that's without any judgment, because it is something that requires a depth of commitment depending on the spectrum of caregiving that you choose to engage in.
Absolutely. It's really important to highlight that caregiving looks different for everybody, whether it's in your own home, it's in their home, it's in a facility. It can all be very challenging. Lisa, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wonderful story, and I really appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you, Pooja, for creating this platform and for getting this very valuable information out to people.
Thank you for tuning in to the Aging Together podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Aging Together, LLC, a caregiver coaching service with educational programming and support services for family caregivers of older adults. This episode was produced by me, Dr. Pooja Ashok Patel, in partnership with Natural Eye Media. If you found this episode of the Aging Together podcast valuable, we'd love your support in spreading the word. Please subscribe to the show. Your likes, shares, and reviews fuel our mission. Don't forget to rate and leave a review wherever you're listening. Your feedback matters. Until next time, take care.